We are here for the next few hours to give you all of your top stories, breaking news headlines, and of course, your live events of the day. As we come on the air, we do want to begin with the very latest of the Trump presidency. Take a look at your screen. This is the latest video that we have into our Live Now from Fox Studio as Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni arrived in Washington, D.C. This is all for a meeting today with President Donald Trump. We're told hopes are to ease tensions over U.S. tariffs on European goods and position herself as a bridge between Washington and Brussels. Our content partners over at Reuters reporting this morning that Meloni is walking a tightrope between her ideological affinity to the president and her ties with European allies who have been very critical of President Donald Trump's tariff hikes and his decision to exclude the EU from talks with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. A lot to discuss, so we want to bring into the conversation political analyst and historian Rich Rubino. Rich, good morning to you. Always a pleasure. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. My pleasure as well.
So we just saw the latest video as the Italian Prime Minister arrived there at the nation's capital. Set the stage for this anticipated visit, this coming on the heels of President Donald Trump meeting just days ago with the president of El Salvador.
Yes, and there's definitely affinity between Donald Trump and conservative leaders. When he met with the president of El Salvador, for example, he was very much a populist conservative who had actually spoken at the Conservative Political Action Committee last year. He's meeting today with the Italian prime minister, who's also very much a populist conservative. At least when she ran for prime minister, she ran as a populist conservative, and she's actually spoken at conservative events in the United States. So he really likes people he has an ideological affinity for. That being said, there has somewhat of a, he can very much compartmentalize sometimes leaders that he likes with policies he has toward those leaders. I think for Trump, it's very much realpolitik. It comes down to sometimes not necessarily supporting leaders that you are having affinity with ideologically, but it comes down to policies. And I think in terms of Italy, the fact that they have such a large surplus with the United States, he put tariffs on Italy as well as other European Union countries. So it'll be very interesting to see if they can make some sort of a deal between Italy and the United States to try to relieve some of these tariffs, to relieve certainly not only the 10% base tariff, but potentially some of the other tariffs that he paused if he were to increase the tariffs again toward Italy. So it's a very interesting relationship there.
Very interesting indeed. And along with the tariffs, we are thinking that there could be discussions related to the Russia-Ukraine war, as we've seen several mornings right here on Live Now from Fox. The European Commission and even European Parliament, they do go back and forth to try to get a ceasefire between those two countries.
Yes, and this is another issue where Donald Trump has been somewhat skeptical of Mr. Zelensky in the Ukraine. Contrary-wise, Meloni has been very much a vociferous, virulent ally of the president of Ukraine. So this is something where I think there's kind of a divide in the conservative movement. You see it right here in the United States, for example, the last presidential election. Folks like Donald Trump, for example, Vivek Ramaswamy, were very skeptical toward continuing to aid Ukraine. But then you had the more establishment Republicans like Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador and governor of South Carolina, who has very much said that they needed to support Ukraine. Vice President Mike Pence, another one who said they needed to support Ukraine. So this is where you have kind of a schism, if you will, in the conservative movement.
Rich, I'm glad you brought up that support as it relates to European entities. This is the very latest quote. As Meloni supports EU's 0 for 0 tariff deal offer, she says, quote, "We know we are in a difficult moment. Most certainly, I am well aware of what I represent and what I am defending," end quote. Getting back to the tariffs, I think this further shows that tightrope that Meloni is having to walk, not only to please the U.S., but also those EU allies.
Yes, and she's somebody, when she ran for office, she was very much a Eurosceptic. She was very much a nationalist, almost. If there was an Italian version of Donald Trump's America First, it would be Meloni's Italy First. But when she came to power, she became a lot more moderate, a lot more conciliatory, a lot more of an establishment leader toward the Europeans. So now she has this very interesting issue. On the one hand, she ran as a nationalist. She's someone who kind of wanted to put Italy first, if you will. So now she has to negotiate for her own country, but she also has the 26 other members of the European Union who view her as an emissary or somebody who will try to conciliate or somebody who will try to negotiate their interests with Donald Trump. So is she the nationalist that she ran on, or is she the more conciliatory and moderate who will try to support the interests of her European Union allies? That's something to be very interesting question just to watch.
Absolutely. And we are hearing this morning, Rich, that Maloney is trying to position herself between Washington and
Yeah.
Brussels. Could you break down those two entities? What is the conflict between the two? Or is there not really a conflict at all, just a lack of understanding?
I think there is. I think Donald Trump is somebody who's very much a unilateralist. He's very much someone who has a go it alone strategy. He talks about America first. He talks about how other countries in NATO, for example, are not spending enough of their GDP on the military. Many of those NATO members are also members of the European Union. Italy is one example. Italy spends less than 2% of their GDP, for example, on defense. Donald Trump very much says that the other countries should be spending the same amount as the United States is spending in terms of their GDP on the military. And he's somebody, and whereas the European Union, I think that the European Union countries, they have the 10% kind of across the board tariff placed on them. Donald Trump originally had a lot higher tariffs, but he paused those tariffs for 90 days. And I think that the leader of Italy, obviously Italy is a part of the European Union, despite the fact that Mrs. Maloney ran as a Eurosceptic when she ran for prime minister. She very much is part of the European Union, and they all basically want the tariffs to be relieved. But she's also somebody who I think that even though she somewhat speaks for the European Union, at the end of the day, she's an Italian and she has to speak for Italy. So I think there's a possibility that she could work some sort of a bilateral agreement to for tariff relief with the United States without necessarily consulting or trying to advocate, if you will, for her allies in the European Union.
Great perspective there, Rich. And as we further discuss this anticipated visit and discussion with President Donald Trump and the Italian Prime Minister, again, we just saw the latest video as Maloney arrived in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday. But here's the breakdown so the viewers can follow along of the agenda for today. So at noon Eastern time, President Donald Trump will greet the Italian Prime Minister Maloney. Then at 12:05 Eastern time, President Donald Trump will participate in a bilateral lunch with the Prime Minister. 1:05 Eastern time, President Trump participates in that bilateral meeting with the Italian Prime Minister. And then 4 p.m., President Donald Trump signs executive orders in the Oval Office. So, Rich, obviously a very busy day for President Donald Trump. We know sometimes with those bilateral meetings, we don't get inside as there are closed door discussions, but then a media briefing could be held shortly after. But a lot of people like, okay, you have these closed door talks. We are focused on, EU-U.S. relations. And then right after, President Donald Trump doesn't stop. He's already signing more executive orders today, Rich.
Yes, he really works at whether you like him or you dislike him, he's really somebody that works at a frenetic pace. He's somebody sometimes that will invite the press, for example, into when he actually signed executive orders. If you remember the first day in office, he actually spoke to supporters, and when he was speaking to them, he actually started to sign executive orders. So I think he's somebody that can really kind of go from one issue to the next. But then again, a lot of presidents do that. If you think about it, they'll be working all day, they'll be meeting with congressional leaders, and then at night they'll be able to speak to a fundraiser. So you really have to have that kind of indefatigable ability to kind of work really kind of 18-hour days.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind me sharing this as well, Rich, my producer, Julianne, found this. Italy and U.S., courtesy of X, formerly known as Twitter. It says, quote, Italy is looking forward to welcoming VP J.D. Vance to Rome on April 18th for a meeting with the Italian Prime Minister. So not only are the talks, those bilateral talks happening here in the U.S. today on this Thursday, a day after the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, will be in Rome to have a meeting with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. So we see this back and forth and how the U.S. is not letting up to make sure that the allies are pleased, but not only pleased, that the U.S. has what they need to have a successful America.
Yes, and this is something, again, that ideological similitude between leaders And I think that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, while they may not necessarily have the same policy aims, they do have the same ideological aims. And that's why, for example, you saw the leader of El Salvador come in earlier this week, who's very much aligned with Donald Trump ideologically. And then you have both Donald Trump meeting and then J.D. Vance meeting again with the Italian prime minister. The United States, I think, has very few allies, perhaps Hungary, maybe, and certainly Italy in terms of ideological allies with the United States. And they certainly are doing everything they can to try to harness those relations.
Political analyst and historian Rich Rubino, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us bright and early on this Thursday to set the stage with President Donald Trump and also with the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Again, she is set to have these closed-door discussions with President Trump right here in the U.S. later today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You would do the same.
Thank you. I want to get back to the latest developments. If you're just now tuning in, I want to show you this graphic. We just showed it to you momentarily during the interview with Rich. Again, President Donald Trump and the Italian Prime Minister having these discussions there in Washington, D.C. We got this information from the Office of Communications. Again, things kicking off around noon Eastern time. President Donald Trump will greet the Italian Prime Minister, 12:05, a bilateral lunch. Then President Trump will participate in a bilateral meeting with the Italian Prime Minister. And then at 4 p.m., President Trump will sign more executive orders inside of the Oval Office. So a very busy day for the president. And then also we are looking ahead to tomorrow as VP Vance will be in Rome to have his own discussions with the Italian Prime Minister. So we are definitely keeping a close eye on all things Trump presidency. And speaking of the Trump presidency, I want to transition your screen to give you a live look at the White House here at 610 on the East Coast as we get more updates. And of course, if we get any press conferences or press gaggle from everything related to President Donald Trump, you will get it in full right here on Live Now from Fox.